The topic I'm going to cover today is complexity across languages, and this is like all the diversity and the differences that you see in morphology and syntax and grammar and rules. Now, as we've discussed previously in the course, grammar rules are really just very strong conventions. They're not really rules, but when everybody does a thing, everyone considers that that thing is therefore the right thing. Like, for example, I can't say, "You seen me got it in the car," and drive away. You understand what I'm trying to say, though, so why can't I just say that? Why isn't that good enough? Well, it's just because, as a society, we've all adopted a collective pact that there's a right way and a wrong way to say something. And as long as we all agree, then that right way is the rule. But if the rule is confusing, then people might not always obey it. And so you start seeing that the norms will change. And when enough people change the norms, then they literally change the rules. Now, what I want to talk about today is how these rules get started in the first place. The point of rules is to reduce potential confusion or ambiguity. So in order for you to see what I mean, let's imagine a language without rules, or I guess I should say at least, without very many rules. You would have words, but you wouldn't have a fixed word order, or prefixes, or suffixes, or tense, or inflection, or anything like that. So you can imagine in this language that you might want to convey an idea to someone. Like, let's say you wanted to say something like, "I think you're pretty and charming. I wonder if you'd like to go out sometime." But in this language, you don't have a standard way of communicating that. So you just spit out your words in whatever order the ideas pop into your mind, because there's no fixed way of communicating this. So you might say something like, "Pretty girl, me want date. Friday, Saturday, other day, any day. Charming, you, me, eat you, someplace." Now, this is obviously not the most attractive proposal, but problematically, it's not entirely clear either. So by standardizing things like word order and case markers into formal rules, we can create sentences that others are certain to interpret correctly. And that reduces confusion and ambiguity. So that's the reason why we have rules. Now, many languages have flexible word orders, which means you can basically say things in any order or multiple different possible orders. And so the ordering of your words in a sentence don't really communicate anything about like what's the subject or what's the object of the sentence. Instead of relying on word order, these languages often have what are called case markers to do the job. And case markers are morphemes, like a set of letters that are attached to a noun to identify who did what to whom. So in English, if you wanted to say a sentence like, "The dog bites the man," we depend on word order to know that this sentence is different from "the man bites the dog," which is, an unusual and unlikely sentence, but, somebody could bite a dog, and if that happened, you'd want to be able to communicate that, and the way you would do that is through word order. By putting the man first, we expect that he is the subject, he is doing this verb biting, and he's biting the object last, the dog. But in German, if you wanted to express this counterintuitive idea that the man bites the dog, you can legally use either of the sentence orders. You could either say the man bites the dog or the dog bites the man, because word order isn't fixed in German. Instead, they use these case markers to tell who's the actor and who's the recipient or the object. So let me give you these examples here. We've got "Der Mann beißt den Hund." Okay, the man bites the hound. Or we've got "Den Hound beißt den Mann." And you can see here we've got the man as the first order in the first example sentence and the man in the last order in the second sentence. But what we've got here as case markers are the differences der and den. Der means this is the subject. Den means this is the object. So by putting der Mann, then we have an indication here that the man is the subject regardless of where he appears in the sentence. Even if in the second sentence he appears last, he's still the subject. So this word order is literally the hound bites the man, but translated into English, we would say the man bites the dog, or we could say the dog was bitten by the man if we wanted to retain that same kind of word order. But you can see that it's by these case markers of the N or the R that's indicating which of the nouns in the sentence is the subject and which is the object. Now again, I can indicate here the opposite meaning if I just flip the case markers. So the same word orders exist as did above, but here I've just indicated den Mann and der Hund instead of what we had before. So this indicates the man is the object of the sentence, and the hound is the subject of the sentence. So regardless of the word order, we can indicate with these case markers that in this situation, the man was bitten by the hound, or the hound bit the man. Now in German, as I was just describing, articles are always marked, so you can easily tell who's doing what in a sentence. But there are languages that don't use case markers all the time. They still have flexible word order, so they need case markers, but they don't use them in every situation. They'll use them for like some nouns and not others. And the times when they're used are just those times when they're needed because they're going to be helpful to reduce ambiguity. So for example, there's one language called Sinhalese where word order is flexible and you can say things in either SOV or OSV. So the verb always has to come last, but you can flip around the subject or the object at the beginning of the sentence. So since they have this flexible word order, they have to use case markers, and in their language they use the case marker wa, W-A, as a suffix on direct objects. In other words, they tack it to the end of direct objects, but only objects that are animate. So let me give you an example so you can see what I'm talking about. Let's say that we wanted to describe two people, one who was pulling the other. So in English we would say Amara pulled Leilani. But in this other language, you would be able to say it either Amara Leilani Eda or Leilani Amara Eda. Either way, you could put either the subject or the object first. Doesn't matter if it's Amara Leilani or Leilani Amara. But in order to indicate which person was being pulled, you have to indicate with a WA the object of the sentence. So whether we put Leilani in the second order or in the first order, we have to indicate that she's the object of the sentence, and so we indicate that with the wa ending. So this sentence would be uttered either as Amara Leilani wa Eda or Leilani wa Amara Eda. You could see that if you were using an object, an inanimate object in the sentence instead of another person, an animate thing, then you would not be allowed to use this wa case marker. So remember that, or I just have chosen here to indicate that this sentence is invalid by, or these two sentences are invalid by indicating that with red. So I've chosen to color this red to show that this is an incorrect way of conjugating this sentence. So Amara potawa gata, you can't use this wa here because if we're trying to say that Amara bought a book, we can't indicate that the book is the object of the sentence because, of course, a book cannot purchase Amara. It can't do that. And so in this situation, it's redundant. It's unnecessary to add this little indicator here to say whether the book is the subject or the object of the sentence. So in Sinhalese, you can either say Amara Pata Gada or Pata Amara Gada. It doesn't matter if you put Amara or the book first. You could put book first, then Amara, or Amara first, then the book. It doesn't matter. But you cannot use this ending wa because that's redundant. It's unnecessary given that the book cannot do any purchasing. Now, across languages, case markers like this crop up wherever the potential for ambiguity is the greatest. So, as we saw in this example, case markers were really only used when the object was animate, like a person, but it's not used when it's an inanimate object, like a book. Earlier in the history of Sinhalese, it's quite likely that people used case markers for both animate and inanimate objects, but that over time, people who spoke this language might start dropping the case markers that aren't necessary until it's actually considered a rule in your language to only use them when they are necessary. Similarly, if other aspects of a language like word order can step up and kind of take responsibility for disambiguating a sentence, then case markers aren't necessary because the word order is doing it instead. And so, if you have a case marker system and a word order system, one of them is likely to erode over time. Like, if word order steps up, then the case marker system will erode, will fall out of favor, and people will stop using the case markers because they're redundant, they're unnecessary. Word order is communicating everything you need to say. Now, we can see this in the laboratory, how these types of changes, like dropping case markers when they're not necessary, end up occurring. Researchers in one study brought in participants and taught them an artificial language that had a flexible word order that was very similar to what I just described about Sinhalese, where they could either order things as SOV or OSV. The verb always had to come last, but you could put either the subject or the object first. And that ended up meaning that speakers couldn't assume that the hearers would be able to understand the meaning of a sentence based solely on its word order. So in order to compensate for the lack of a structured word order, the artificial language that these researchers invented also contained optional case markers, which meant that speakers had the opportunity, if they wanted to try and disambiguate sentences if they saw that it might be confusing. Again, this is just like we saw in Sinhalese, where we put the wa suffix at the end of certain words if there was a potential that it might be confusing, but we didn't use them when they weren't. The funny thing was, unlike languages where the case marker is reliably used to distinguish only certain kinds of things like animate objects, in this artificial language that the researchers invented, they didn't distribute the case markers in a selective way to prevent the worst ambiguities. Instead, they would just kind of adhere them. They would just put them randomly throughout the language so that sometimes there were confusing, ambiguous sentences. So, for example, case marking appeared just as often on inanimate objects as they did on animate ones, despite the fact that such markers are really much more useful for disambiguating meaning when they're used on the animate objects, like we saw with Sinhalese. So participants in this study would come into the lab 4 times, and they would do these training sessions with the tutor, and they would learn the language. And even though they were exposed to input from the artificial language, where the case markers were evenly doled out between animate and inanimate nouns, that's not how the participants ended up using the language themselves when it came time for them to try and communicate with that language. Instead, they shifted the language toward differential case marking, where they just attached the case markers only on animate objects much more often than inanimate ones, because those are the situations that were most likely to be confusing, given the randomized kind of word order of subject and object. So this experiment suggested that when the grammar of a language leaves room open for confusion, new learners of that language, especially adult learners, will kind of come along and fix it by using the tools that the language already has in place in more systematic ways so that they can help to reduce the ambiguity. If these research participants were to then take this same language and go and use it with other adults or with their own children, their use of the more systematic patterns of the case markers, like attaching them to animate objects, would end up being modeled for the other people who are learning the language from them. And they might, in turn, keep improving the way that the case markers are used until, after just a few generations of teaching new learners of this language, a feature of the language that used to be haphazard when it came from the researchers would then become institutionalized as a rule in the language. So, in other words, the researchers started the language with random case markers, but after just one generation, just teaching the students, already the students were using this rule as more systematic. And after teaching it to other people, presumably it would become even more and more institutionalized until it became, across a whole group of people, it would become a rule rather than just like a suggestion or just one possible way of wording something. Okay, so what I've been explaining so far is the process by which rules get instantiated in a language. How they start just as like regular norms, but then they become very formalized and they become rules. But even though that's what I've been talking about, my larger point that I've actually been trying to make is to illustrate some of the reasons why languages vary so dramatically in their structure and rules. And so in order to address that, I'm going to say that the reason for that is because there are so many different solutions to the problem of ambiguity. So there are tons and tons of different possible ways that you can solve various communication challenges. And so far, I've been talking about case markers and word order, but you could also have all kinds of other solutions. Like you could have very large vocabularies with words that communicate very precise things, instead of like a smaller vocabulary with more recursion and flexibility in sentence construction. Or you could have, a language with relatively few phonemes, in which case you'd have to have really long words in order for them to be differentiated, because like you'd only have a few sounds in your language, and if you have only just a few sounds, then you have to have really long words that are made up of just like the few letters that you have, in order for the words to mean different things. But if you have lots of phonemes, then you can have relatively shorter words, because the shorter words can be differentiated by the lots of different phonemes that you have. Or your language could be constructed in a very flexible way that allows you to create different forms of words. Like, think about in English how you can add the suffix ness, N-E-S-S, to all kinds of words, like even ones that aren't widely used or have never been used before. But you could say like, the speckledness of this carpet is appealing to me. Well, somebody might never have said speckledness before, but you all know what I mean by speckledness. It's indicating an attribute of something that is, I'm changing an adjective into an adverb, I think. Though, forgive me, I'm not that great at English grammar. In any case, you could also have very rigid word creation rules, like in Japanese or Mandarin. You're not allowed to create new forms of words. Instead, you have to separate standalone words that modify the other words in a sentence. So it's similar to how we use ness at the end of words as a suffix, but it's not allowed to be part of the same word. You would just tack in like a separate modifying word into the sentence. Another example is you might have a language that would keep all the sentences short, or another one might allow them to grow very long. But regardless of what different solutions we're talking about here, what we repeatedly find across languages is that when you have a feature of a language that could potentially pose constraints or introduce ambiguity, the users of the language will end up adopting another feature in their language to compensate for that. So, like, even though some aspects of a foreign language might feel very confusing to you because of your particular native language that you speak, there could be other aspects of that foreign language that kind of balance things out a bit, so that lots of languages end up being a pretty similar degree of complexity on the whole. So like a different language might have like more confusing case markers than yours, but it might have a more easy word order than yours. Or it might have like a smaller vocabulary, but it might compensate for that by having like flexible word creation rules or something like that. So even though different things might feel confusing about a language, other things would balance that out likely, so that it would feel like on the whole it's not actually that confusing a language. A final reason we have so many differences in the forms and amounts of complexity that exist across different languages is how languages come about. Now, remember back to early in the course when we learned about how languages evolve over time. We know it's similar to the process of biological evolution. Remember, random mutations in DNA end up resulting in variability in a population. And when a population gets separated into two groups, then they can develop along independent trajectories. So, like, you might have a common ancestor. That common ancestor could be separated geographically, and then you would end up with two distinct species, like a woolly mammoth and an elephant. Well, just like mutations can randomly occur and spread unevenly within a species, linguists believe that small random linguistic mutations can eventually lead to distinct languages among speakers in that same way if they have little contact with each other. So you might start with a common language, and then if the people who speak that language get separated geographically, it might independently develop in different trajectories, and you could end up with two similar but different languages, like Spanish and Portuguese, which share some words in common, but also have some that are different and some grammatical differences. Well, this could be like, this could happen all the time. Like if a single tribe were to have a rift and split into two, then over a few hundred years, the two tribes will have so many pronunciation changes and mutations in their vocabulary over that time that the two tribes would end up speaking independent languages. But the complexity of language can also be impacted by who is doing the learning. Like, some languages are spoken by many people, and they serve as a sort of common tongue for people with varying native languages to communicate. English is a great example of this, but another example is Swahili, where, like, if you look at Kenya, a map of Kenya, there are hundreds of tribal languages in Kenya. But if you want to speak to a person that is from another tribe that speaks another language, then the default is to use Swahili. It's just kind of like almost like the national language. It's just the common tongue. And you find that Hindi provides a very similar function in India. There are actually thousands of languages spoken in India, practically like one per every city. But if someone living there wanted to talk to another person in another city who speaks a different native language, then they would switch both of them to their common second language, Hindi, because that's the common tongue that everybody speaks there. So the thing is, when lots of people are learning these common languages, we call these exoteric languages because they're used by many people in common. They don't always have the patience to learn silly, useless rules. People learning these languages learn the rules that they most need in order to make sure that what they're saying is really clear, but not necessarily right, like grammatically correct, in the rule-following sense, because it probably doesn't matter that much to them. Their main goal is just to achieve a certain function. It's not to be impressive in some kind of social sense. Well, when you get enough people learning these common languages as their second languages and breaking all the silly rules, then the silly rules stop really being rules at all. And as researchers, we assume this must be happening because it's this kind of thing that happens in experiments with artificial languages. But also, researchers have done studies where they look at patterns in these kinds of exoteric languages that are like English or Swahili or Hindi, and they see that these languages actually do have fewer silly rules than we find in some of the more esoteric ones that are just spoken by a single tribe in an isolated area. So like in English, it's easy to say something in past tense by adding the ending ed. But some words break that rule. Like we don't say eated. The past tense of eat is ate. But English has fewer of these irregular exceptions now than we did in the past. So, just by way of context, the past tense of study literally used to be stowed. It was an irregular verb. But over time, people started to say studied, just adding that ed. Similar story with help. Help used to have a past tense hope, but over time people didn't use that irregular verb form, and so instead they just started adding ed, and they started making it into a regular verb. Of course, we still have some irregular verbs, but way fewer than in the past. Like if you look at these examples, get, find, give, go, they have irregular past tense forms. Back in Old English, about 75% of our verbs were irregular, like this kind here, like these kinds that you can't just add an ed to. But now, just 3% of English verbs are irregular. And so if you think about that, the reason why that happened was the same as what happened with study and help. They used to have irregular past tense forms, but we regularized them. And the way that happened, as I described on the last slide, new adult learners of a language as their second language didn't want to bother with all these silly rules, like learning that study had a past tense of stowed and help had a past tense of hope. And so they just regularized them and started adding ed to a lot of words where it wasn't necessarily correct, but they made it correct by just doing that, by just choosing that that's what they're going to do. Now, these kind of words right here, like get, find, give, and go, these kinds of words could eventually become things like getted, finded, gived, and goed. But it's unlikely, well, at least at any time soon, because they're already so common that it's easy to just memorize the few exceptions if you're learning English as a second language and these words are used very often. But there are less common words that are irregular verbs, like bend and dig, the past tense of which are bent and dug. But they're more likely to end up regularized within the next 100 years or so because they're not that frequently used in common language. Like we don't use bent or dug as often as we use like got and found and gave and went. And if you think about it, like using the regular but incorrect forms of these verbs actually isn't that startling. Like if I were to say the sentence, she bended over, or he digged around the tree, they don't actually sound that weird. And so that's why, again, they're at risk of becoming regularized in the next 100 years or so. Or, as another example, like right now the the proper past tense of the word broadcast is also broadcast. But many people have already started saying broadcasted, making it a regular verb, even though it's not supposed to be. It's supposed to be an irregular verb. So you can see that when exoteric languages are learned by lots of non-native speakers, they become simplified in some of their rules because, like I said, silly and unnecessary rules end up getting changed or dropped or standardized. And on the other hand, languages that are mostly used in isolated communities and are only learned by children as they're growing up, and who are brilliant at mastering language. I mean, children are just phenomenal at getting the rules of language. Then these kinds of esoteric languages that are only learned in these isolated communities end up remaining relatively more complex because children can afford the mental energy to learn all the silly rules that that adult learners of a second language aren't patient enough to learn.